Almost Shabbat Shalom. It's still Yahweh 5 here in a little bit, about 40 minutes. It'll be Yahweh 6 and it'll be the great Sabbath day. But as we prepare for the Sabbath day, we're going to be in the 16th book of Yisrayl. The 16th book of Yisrayl, chapter 34. This is the Sea of Glass book. We're going to be starting on page 375. 16th book of Yisrayl, chapter 34. The title of the sermon that Pastor gave back on Romans 10:16, 2016. The title of the sermon was The Sons of Yahweh, Yeshub or Eob's, Job's sons, and the House of Yahweh. This was given at the Feast of Tabernacles on 10/16, 2016 Roman calendar. Pastor starts off here, Shalom everyone, in verse 1 on page 376 of the 16th book of Yisrayl. Shalom everyone, you're looking great, joyful cheering and praise to Yahweh with the waving of palm branches. Praise Yahweh, you may be seated. I hope you heard what the man said on the news. If they fail, when they fail, we're going to be picking up the pieces. That's beautiful. They're repeating our words. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. He talks about here about the news being great, because it's actually showing in detail the prophecies coming to pass. Every day you see this in the news with what's taking place, both here in the land we live in and lands far away, and especially the prophecies that concern, that fourth part of the earth in and around the great river Euphrates, where a third of man will be killed by nuclear burning. And we see these things coming to pass right before our very eyes. We see the build-up for war. We see all these preparations taking place. And this is what Pastor's talking about, the news being great. It's not great to see the misery that the world's going in, and the fact of misery is not a great thing. But it's great to see Yahweh's prophecies being fulfilled and coming to pass in these last days. Praise Yahweh. And tonight here in law class, we're just going to be covering, I do encourage you men to study these chapters during the week, because we're only covering a couple key points here as we bring forth the laws of Yahweh as taught by the great overseer Yisrael Hawkins, the only one authorized to teach Yahweh's laws in these last days. But I do encourage you to study these chapters, chapter 34 and the 16th book of Yisrael. If you haven't this week, study it next week, and then maybe even start the chapter 35 studying it. It really helps if we go through these sermons throughout our studies during the week, the ones we go over in law class, and the ones we go over in the workshops on Sabbath afternoon, the second book of Yisrael, going on to perfection. It helps to allow more absorption into our mind of what's being taught, and it's really amazing when you watch and if you go through the sermon, and then when you come to services and pastor's bringing a new sermon, it's truly amazing how it's line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. There's things taking place that he's talked about back in, the early 90s is when the Going On to Perfection series. And there's things taking place in the news right now that he talked about back then. And then also there's some more detail about what he's talking about here in these last days and at this time period, which is almost 20-something years after those sermons were written. But here in verse 3 on page 376 of the 16th book of Yisrayl, Pastor says, if you remember, I spent a lot of time trying to get everyone to understand how this feuding got started and retaliation. You need to keep this in your mind. Don't forget it. You need to always guard yourself against getting angry. All right, and for your notes, or if you have your book of Yahweh, if you go over to Genesis chapter 4, we'll be able to see where this took place, this feuding and this retaliation, this war, where it actually started. Genesis chapter 4, and this is, if you look at verse 8, if you have the new book of Yahweh, and if you don't, if you have an older book of Yahweh, and verse 8 was written, and these things took place about 3875 BY, so 3,875 years before Yeshua. It talks about, now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were spread abroad that Cain rose against Abel his brother, and he killed him. And Yahweh said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know, am I my brother's keeper? Okay, and if you jump back up quickly in verse 6, Yahweh said to Cain, why are you angry? Why are you downcast? If you do righteousness, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do righteousness, sin is crouching at your door. The desire to sin is with you, but you must overcome it. So you can see Cain's face was not showing the character of Yahweh. It was showing anger and hatred. And Yahweh was trying to warn him back in 3,875 years before Yeshua, which I don't know the quick math, but it'd be somewhere around, 5,800 and something years from our time period, right? If you do the math, 3,875 plus 2018, you can see the anger that Cain had. And he had the anger because he wasn't practicing righteousness, because he was, allowing sin into his life, and he was being corrected by Abel, his brother, who was the priest of Yahweh at that time. And instead of humbling himself to these teachings, he actually became angry and hateful. And so you see here in verse 14, Genesis 4:14, Cain said, "Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall not be seen by your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, for there shall be continual war, vengeance, and retaliation." All right, so these are where those things came. This didn't start, 1979 when the Shah of Iran was overthrown and there became an Islamic Republic, or, several decades ago when certain people were put into power in Syria. This didn't start when Israel formed their country and took over the land of Palestine. These things started 5,800 something years ago, this vengeance, this war, and this retaliation, because Cain was refusing to accept the instructions that came from Yahweh. And then, you see the history in the scriptures from Genesis all the way down, and you start seeing even like in 1 Samuel chapter 8, you start seeing how the people rejected the instructions that Yahweh was given. They did not want to have a teacher of righteousness. Okay, and this is what we have to be really careful about, is that we don't get wise in our own understandings. We have to have a teacher. We have to have someone leading and guiding us. And Yahweh's appointed the only one that's authorized to do that in these last days, who is Pastor Yisrayl Hawkins. And without his instructions and teachings, we could be off in all different kinds of fields, running around chasing like the Catholic Church does with their apparitions and their visions, and looking for all their great dead people that they can create a saint. So really be mindful to continue to study the words and the teachings that pastor's putting forth, and apply them into your life, so that you can prove to Father Yahweh that you want to qualify. We have to prove to Father Yahweh that we desire to qualify to be a part of his kingdom. And it's going to be tough. You read the scriptures, it's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy. You're not going to be able to receive the greatest positions on the earth, just easily, wow, I found the House of Yahweh. I found this booklet. It was flying down the highway or something, and I pulled over and grabbed it. That's the hardest test I had, was to grab that booklet off the highway. Now everything's going to be easy. Now remember that our judgment begins when we come to Yahweh's house. This is when we start being tested and tried and proven for a position in Yahweh's kingdom. And the more that we overcome, and the more that we qualify, to be able to take hold of, then the more that we continue to work towards these great positions in Yahweh's kingdom. And be not deceived, men. Yahweh has called us to be these righteous golden vessels in his kingdom, sons of his. This is what we'll be seeing here in this sermon, that, actual sons of Yahweh, to be able to be used in bringing peace to the entire universe, to the earth first and then to the entire universe. And the original sons of Yahweh, they rejected this position because they allowed themselves to be deceived by listening to another teacher, not Yahweh's teacher. They allowed themselves to be listening to Satan and following her in her rebellion. Same with Cain. Remember Cain? He allowed himself to be influenced negatively. He didn't do like Yeshua said in Matthew chapter 4, "You get behind me, Satan. Yahweh your Father you must reverence, and him only you must serve." He's like, "Oh, really? We can eat pork? Oh, okay. Oh, we can keep Christmas? Oh, all right. Oh, we don't got to go on the seventh-day Sabbath. We can go play gladiator games Sunday afternoon, and we just keep Sunday? Sure, that's great. Sounds awesome. Let's go do that." He allowed himself to be led into a deception, and before he knew it, he was just consumed with anger and hatred, where he actually led those who followed him to rise up and kill Abel. Now, Pastor says here, keep this in your mind where this started, okay? So maybe in your book, if you have a book right there, you write Genesis chapter 4. Don't forget it. You need to always guard yourself against getting angry. No, you have no right to get angry at me. This is pastor teaching, okay? We have no right to get angry at the one Yahweh sent. You have no right to get angry at your husband. You have no right to get angry with your wife or your children. I've seen people jerk children up and spank them. This is the cruelest thing you can do. What you need to do is teach them, okay? And if you write down in your notes, Proverbs chapter 4, we see in Proverbs chapter 4, it talks here, verses 10 through 27 about instruction. And it says here in verse 21 or verse 20, "My son, pay attention to my laws and incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them out of your sight. Keep them in the center of your heart." Remember what Pastor said new moon evening, Yahweh won the other night. Remember what he was saying? We have three different minds. We have our brain, we have our heart, and we have our mind lower down. And he said, make sure that our decisions are being made either with our brain or with our heart, but don't let it go any lower. Don't allow lust and confusion to actually lead us astray from Yahweh's instructions. Do not let them out of your sight, Proverbs 4:21. Keep them in the center of your heart, for they mean life to those who find them and health to their whole body. Guard your mind with all diligence, for out of it flows the springs of life. So we have to be diligently practicing the instructions that Yahweh has given us in these last days. Okay, we have to be, because if we're not, we're going to allow ourselves to be led off in some sort of deception, And the thing about deception is you never realize, someone who's deceived never realizes they're deceived. Cain didn't realize he was deceived. He's thinking, man, life's going to be easy now, right? Abel's dead. I ain't got that nagging voice, telling me what I'm doing wrong. Just do what I want to do. No, he brought death upon himself. And he's actually brought this confusion upon the entire earth. So we got to be mindful, men. Instead of getting angry and spanking our children, try to teach them, And if you say, well, I don't have children, so I can get angry. No. We need to be mindful, men, that instead of getting angry, and lashing out or getting frustrated and all riled up with our brothers, that we should work with them. We should work with them, and maybe there's things we have to teach them about why we're doing certain things, or maybe there's things that they're trying to teach us that we have to humble ourselves to be able to hear and to apply. Okay, we shouldn't allow ourselves to get angry, and not nip it off real quick. We learn in the Peaceful Solution that it's normal to be angry, which it is, but the problem is that if you allow anger to stay there, as the Scripture says, past the sun going down, then what does it start doing? It starts leading to all these negative feelings, before you know it, you're enraged, and you're ready to tell someone, a little piece of your mind, or pull out a little chunk of that carnal mind, just throw it at them, let them really have a piece of their little hearing, little earful. Continuing in verse 4 on page 376, Pastor continues and he says, I remember I got some training in this field from Mother. And you see Pastor he really learned a lot from his mother, and that she was a very righteous woman with the knowledge that she had at that time period. And you can see how Yahweh, as we see in Revelations, that how Yahweh actually allowed her to bring forth this man. Because she did a lot of training with him and making sure that he was strict in following what the Scriptures said. Now remember, they didn't have a book of Yahweh back then, so they were using, a King James Bible or whatever Bible renditions came out at that time period. I think some of the first ones they seen in Oklahoma was the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bibles were pushed out, but they were like the King James rendition. Pastor says, I got some training in this field from Mother. I would drop something on the floor, spill it, and I'd start crying. She said, it's okay. And she'd get me something else to play with. It's a great biblical lesson. Cain didn't do it. Adam and Eve didn't do it. But you do it. Make up your mind not to retaliate, not to get angry, not to lash back. Let them lash at you. Let them call you names. Pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you. Pray for them. That will do more benefit than slapping them. That just starts the war. Okay, so we see here we can't allow ourselves to get angry and retaliate. Instead, we should be praying for those who spitefully use us or persecute us, or those we just can't get along with. I just can't get along with that Kamatithya. He always wants me to do this and that. I just can't do it. No, I don't want to do it. Or whoever you might be dealing with that you can't get along with. Really, men, there's something I remember years ago. watching certain individuals, and they wouldn't be able to deal with certain other individuals. It was like they just couldn't do it, They didn't want to talk to them. They didn't want to hear from them. They didn't want to deal with them at all. One thing I realized that, and Pastor actually wrote it in that song where it talks about it's necessary for men to work with other men. This forms caring, healthy friendships which never end. That it's necessary for us to be able to work with one another. Every one of us to be able to work with whoever we have to deal with, or we get put with, or gets put with us. We have to be able to work together. And if you apply the peaceful solution, which back then this was many years ago. The character education books hadn't all been written down and put out. But if you go back to like the second book of Yisrayl, you'll see way back in the 90s that Pastor was talking about things like setting your mind in advance. Not allowing yourself to get frustrated with your coworker or your wife or your children. Actually preparing yourself for disappointments, for setbacks, and being able to make sure that when they rise up that you're going to have the thinking to make a right choice. He didn't put it into the exact words that we see in the Peaceful Solution until later on, around 1999, when they actually printed all those books. But, if you watch someone apply what Pastor has taught, and this is how you can see that he is the only one that teaches Yahweh's laws, because people can have the scriptures, even the book of Yahweh, they could have it, in their house. They could read it every day. They could read it most of the day. But without having a teacher, they still have some kind of, chip on their shoulder where there's still that person they just can't deal with, And I remember Pastor used to talk about, if you have someone you're having difficulty with, then try to serve them. Go out of your way to serve them and be a benefit to them. Make it a little bit easier and put that smile on your face if you have to, even if it's a fake smile. Try to get really great at a fake smile, but put a smile on your face and go out of your way to serve those people. And when you watch, if we practice these things, you'll start seeing there ain't no one that you can't deal with. It's a joy to work with anyone in Yahweh's house, any man in Yahweh's house, any child. It's a joy to work with them and to be able to actually, help assist Pastor in bearing this burden and pushing forward this great work. So if you find yourself having difficulties with others, do what Pastor said right here in verse 4. Pray for them. Pray for them. And don't be like, oh, Father Yahweh, if you help Kamatithia stop being such a jerk, then I promise I'll work with him better. If you just fix him. No, I think one of the great priests once, he gave a sermon and he said, now I know you're sitting there and you're thinking, wow, this sermon's for me. And he goes, yep, it's for every one of you. So it's easier to see other people's faults. Okay, but we should pray that Yahweh help us to come to the growth and to have His righteous character within our minds to be able to actually deal with all individuals. And if we're having difficulty with someone, if we're having a difficulty with Pastor, especially right here where he said in verse 3, we don't have a right to get angry with him. If we're having difficulty with him, we should really be praying that Yahweh help heal our minds so we be able to come to this humility so that we be able to be used by Yahweh throughout all eternity. The important thing is remembering that, I think it's in the Self-Control Unit, chapter 3, it talks about, there's a quote on the bottom, and it says, always strive to be humble and apologetic and find the peaceful solution. And in the front of every book, it says, 2 wrongs don't make a right. So you see your brother's wrong, and I know he's wrong, I see him wrong. Well, for you to retaliate or act wrong also, that doesn't make anything right. If someone's wrong, they'll be corrected. There's proper channels for dealing with those things. But we need to make sure that we're coming into unity with Yahweh's house by coming into unity with those that Yahweh's placed us with. When we come to Yahweh's house, we have a great priest, the great Khan Israel Hawkins that Yahweh has sent, and we have got to come into unity with him. And then we also have to come into unity with the administration that he set up in these last days. Continuing on here, we're going to go over here to page 377. Page 377 and verse 19. We'll jump up to verse 18. Pastor's showing about here in Revelation chapter 6. In Revelation 6, we see the end result with what is called the quartet and 2 great armies. That's what the scriptures call it. They translated it 200,000 thousands or 200 million or something like that in the King James Version. We fell for the same trick for a while, but anyway, it's two great armies. Those two involve the rest of the world. And then he shows here who's in control. Who's in control, of one of these armies here. He says the Pope and the Vatican, they're so stupid, they probably don't even understand that 90% of these guards that they're putting together are just ISIS anyways. They've given them a way in. They've got passports to get in and wipe them out. You can't run and hide. I could get the Vatican to hear what I'm saying right now. You're too stupid to understand that you're putting together your own executioners. They're going to kill you. They're going to burn you with fire. You're not going to be saved out of this. Every one of you is going to die because you're practicing wickedness. That was what brought this whole thing about. Wickedness, evil. Remember Genesis chapter 4 where Yahweh warned Cain what would take place if he didn't overcome that anger. If he didn't practice righteousness so he could be accepted. It's built up to the fact that they don't care for anyone's life except their own. Just so I'm alive, that's all they care. Okay, so you can see how men's minds have this self-greed, this God image, the God character of, me, I, and this is what we see coming about here with the leadership of the Catholic Church, is that they're interested in saving themselves. Okay, they're interested in saving themselves. So through their deception, they believe that they're actually going to be able to kill all their enemies, and push Queen Mary to the entire earth and force everyone to bow down to this cross, to stop practicing righteousness. But you can also see that those who have been taught and those have been come down, generation upon generation from people who practice certain holiness, they're not interested in giving into this way. We know that we're not going to fight the Vatican. We don't have some great army that we're building. We're going to go out and have a physical fight. No, not at all. Our weapons of war, as the Apostle Shaul said, they're not carnal. They're not physical weapons. We're going to create something greater than the nuclear bomb. No, we're going to teach against these things because they're going to bring themselves to destruction, and then we're going to be the ones who are picking up these pieces, as Pastor started off this sermon. We'll be picking up the pieces of those who are left alive, the 2 billion who's going to survive these great wars that are coming, and then actually be able to start turn things around in a quick time period. Yahweh works super quickly compared to how long it took Satan to bring mankind to this point. Yahweh works super quickly, and he'll have this earth cleaned up within 1,000 years, where everyone who's ever lived is going to have this opportunity to be resurrected, to be taught and trained so they can make a choice. They can make a choice of whether they want life or death, and they'll have a clear mind, a clean body, and they'll have a teacher before them showing them the right and proper way, and they'll be able to, as Pastor's written and talked about a lot, that, surely anyone who could actually see the history, the 6,000 years of mankind going their own way, and then be taught Yahweh's way and how it brings peace, surely anyone would be able to make a right choice in that situation. So praise Yahweh that we see that the Pope and the Vatican, they're setting up their own death. They don't know it, but they're setting up their own death. They're bringing Satan's kingdom. They're bringing Satan's kingdom to a halt. Where she's not going to have even the power to influence any. Not one will even be influenced. And it's funny. A lot of times, you find a large majority of people that are interested in learning the scriptures are Catholics. Because they don't get taught nothing. They don't get taught anything in their churches and their religions except following these customs and these traditions that have been handed down from the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Herodians. So when they actually receive, and this is why the Pope and the Vatican are working so hard to try to push against this message that's being put out, and it's getting put out in all means and availability to the entire world. When Catholic followers actually come across these teachings, they soak these things up because they actually have a great love and desire to understand the Scriptures, to understand the Holy Scriptures, and they're not being taught these things in their churches. So they're actually, real quick to pick up and to actually start, hungering and thirsting after and having that strong zeal to learn Yahweh's way, So you can see how quickly these 2 billion people will be able to be taught and be able to actually be put to work to getting this earth cleaned up. Pastor says in verse 20, it would be a bleak future if the Catholic Church actually survived and started running the world with their homosexual rapists scattered throughout their kingdom. Pope Francis says we've got to sympathize with these sick nuts that are running the Vatican. I'm naming it like it is. They don't see it that way. They see it as beautiful and sparkling. Well, everything that sparkles is not gold, and we have to remember about not seeking after silver and gold, because this is what this rich church is promoting, that if you follow Mother Mary, just like the people told Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 44, when we bow down to the Queen of Heaven and bake cakes for her, man, we had plenty, we sold all our Christmas decorations and, Christmas gifts, and we were able to sell them big fat hogs, when they got old enough and we needed something else to clean up the yard, and we were able to sell those things off to people. We had plenty, and we were really, really doing well. And they actually believed that, the Queen of Heaven, was actually doing these things for them. She was, as they'll say, Mary is the interceder, the one that's going to calm God's wrath. Well, the gods are wrathful, and she might be able to calm the gods because they bow down to her, but Father Yahweh is not wrathful. And he doesn't need to be calmed down because he's pretty calm, very, very patient. As you can see, he's given her 6,000 years here to actually prove her own destruction. If you go over here to verse 24, Revelations chapter 6 and verse 1, on page 378 of the 16th book of Yisrayl, it says, "And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals." And it's showing you here, if you would just pay attention, no one could open these seals except Yeshua, as was revealed in Revelations chapter 2. He's shown to have qualified to open the seals, which means he qualified to be high priest over the house of Yahweh. All of the priests we've ever had for 6,000 years, none of them qualified to be high priest. According to the laws of the Scriptures, none of them qualified. When Yeshua was on the scene, he preached daily at the house of Yahweh, in the sacred precinct. He said, "I've spoken daily with you, teaching these laws." The daily reading of the laws was done in the temple. It was a law to read these laws daily. Yeshua was part of that reading of the laws. Then he said, "Which of you can convict me of sin?" Well, they couldn't. He was sinless, and he qualified to be, finally, a true high priest over the house of Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. Okay, so you can see here, Yeshua, when he was on the scene, he was with them daily. Even these false teachers, he was with them daily because they were still reading the law of Yahweh in the temple, and he was there reading these laws because it was a law to read these laws daily. He didn't have the ability to take a book of Yahweh home. Think about it. Back then, they only had scrolls of the prophets' writings. In order to be able to learn these things, you had to go to places where they had them, and the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Herodians, who later called themselves Catholic, they're the ones who controlled all the writings because they killed the prophets and they took their writings. And they would use them to their own benefit for some things, and then for some things, they would never speak of what was written. Well, men, may Yahweh bless you. Continue to read the law daily, and as we continue in this great law class, I have the great opportunity to turn it over to the great priest of Yahweh, the great Kohan, Kanath Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Please be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. I'm going to go ahead and pick up where the great Kohan left off there. This sermon was really a great sermon at Tabernacles, and like the great Kohan just covered, Pastor laid this sermon out. If you look just at the title, the sons of Yahweh, so he's specifically talking about this sermon is going to deal with the sons of Yahweh, Yashub, or Eob's sons also, and also the house of Yahweh today. And that's what he was talking about in the beginning. In the beginning, he covered the news and the fact that the reading of the law was taking place at that Feast of Tabernacles. The reading of the laws has been moved forward 1 hour tomorrow so the women can all gather together and help decorate the peaceful scene. And he actually talks about the peaceful scene here. And then he goes into the news again. And what I want to pick up at is where the great Kohan was talking about how things were when Yahshua came on the scene. You know, what Yahshua did is what we're doing today. I mean, if you look right there on that page, page 378, in verse 28, Pastor says, we need the daily oblation, as it's called in the King James. I think we called it that too for a while. It was an obligation, okay? He starts defining that word, okay? More like obligation instead of a word oblation. Oblation means obligation or obligated by law to do this. So Yahshua fulfilled that law when he was teaching in the sacred precincts of the House of Yahweh. And of course, again, you know, this sermon, this feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, was a feast where the law was read. Pastor actually goes forward to talk about Yashub. You know, like I say, this sermon, if you read it a couple of times, you can see how he laid everything out. So let's go ahead and go down to verse 30, where he's in the book of Eob, and he says, that man was perfect, talking about Yashub, blameless and upright. He reverenced Yahweh and shunned evil. Now it's going to start going into Eob's sons. Oh, I should just stick with one. I'll stick with Yashub. It'll start going into Yashub's sons. And there's actually you know, if you read the entire sermon, Pastor's making, you know, a correlation, you know, of course, between Eob's sons and the original sons of Yahweh. And he, in verse 31, he says Eob actually understood the universe more than the scientists do today. That was one of the questions I asked when I was taking a course at McMurray University in Abelin, astronomy. I asked about this and they couldn't answer me. I thought how much wiser Eob was than the teachers today. And if you have a book, turn back to the previous day on page 360. Okay, this is the sermon that Pastor gave on the 15th day of that 10th Roman month. And look right in the top at the middle of the page, because this is something that we really have to realize. You know, every second that we are living here on this earth, Yahweh knows what we're doing, how we're doing, what we're going to do, what we did. Look there where it says there's nothing going on in the universe that Yahweh doesn't know about. And of course, this was where he was actually leading up to the sermon that we're covering today, talking about the original sons of Yahweh. But if you look where it's written at, in verse 16, and of course that's on page 360, in verse 16, here a few weeks ago I started bringing out about Halil's sons, Satan's sons, and how they're involved in this. They are the gods, the original gods that Yahweh allowed. There's nothing going on in the universe that Yahweh doesn't know about. You know, and we just need to keep that in mind. You know, Yahweh is in complete control of everything. What we're here to do is to be trained in becoming teachers of righteousness. Okay, so again, Pastor was referring to the fact of how wise Eob was in comparison to the teachers today. Now drop down to 35, and that's now we're back on page 379. In verse 35, Pastor says there are so many great sayings about the rising early. The early bird gets the worm is one. You become rich. There's always associated with richness. And of course, Pastor's talking about the actual wealth of knowledge that's in the book of Yahweh by studying. But it seems like the early people who start studying early, when their minds are fresh, you seem to retain it better than you do after the frustrations start coming in. And I know that each and every one of us has experienced this. You know, if you get up in the morning and you take that time to study, you know, your mind is much more fresh than if you've been working a real long day. And there's nothing wrong with studying at night, but you get home and you get distracted by this, or like Pastor said, the frustrations can seem to come in from the work that took place that previous day. Try always to do that. Try to, at least, I was telling somebody the other day, it's great just to read one page if you have time to when you get up in the morning. Remember that, because we do practice that here in the House of Yahweh. And of course, he's back in verse 5 in the book of Eob. This would be Eob 1:5. And referring to Eob, he says, and of course, the way it is written in that verse, he would rise early in the morning and offer sacrifices for each of them. For he said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed Yahweh in their hearts. And Pastor says, well, here he's telling you that when you practice sin, you're cursing Yahweh. Okay? So it's showing here, and of course, like I say, this is the correlation about the original sons of Yahweh and Eob's sons. You know, Eob was trying to deal with it. He was trying to deal with it in every way that he could. And of course, you could see later, you know, in the book of Eob, and I think even Pastor refers to it, you know, his wife wasn't helping the matter at all. You know, she was probably there siding with the children. And that's another parallel that you can look at when you look at Hillel and the original sons of Yahweh. Okay? Let's see here. They weren't actually saying cursed be Yahweh, anything like that. The wife that was trying to get Eob to curse Yahweh, she was trying to get him to turn to sin and cut himself off from Yahweh. She was blaming Yahweh. You know, and that, you know, the law shows that we can never forget Yahweh. You know, Yahweh is the reason that we even have existence. So we surely don't want to get into that situation of blaming Yahweh. And we may not look at it in a way that we're blaming him. If we're doing something contrary to the law or the teachings as the law is taught by the house of Yahweh and the prophecies, we are blaming Yahweh to an extent. You know, we're trying to make an excuse for ourselves, our own ignorance. Okay, she was blaming Yahweh. His wife was blaming Yahweh for something that Satan was doing. And he goes on there. Even you can see in verse 37 that Eob was doing this, you know, trying to help his sons, you know. And then Pastor explains there in verse 37, this is what Yahweh said, I've never required of you sacrifices. Remember, you know, sacrifices don't help us to convert. You know, what we need to do is be educated in the laws of Yahweh. Okay? Remember this, the 12 tribes were not sacrificing to Yahweh, they were sacrificing to gods. All of the days in the wilderness, when they were offering all of these sacrifices, Yahweh said, did you think I didn't know that you were offering these to the gods? And again, that's what we have to know and understand, you know, is that if we follow the instructions as the law is taught by the house of Yahweh, we won't fall into this trap of actually making excuses, because that's what that is. Drop down to verse 39. And Pastor says, they have you thinking, and of course he gave, you know, an explanation about what the world teaches, you know, this folly wood of what Moses and the Ten Commandments was, and we know that that's all just nothing but falsehood. Pastor says, they have you thinking that these people were in chains and they were beaten with whips, and they were making them pull rocks to build this or that. No, that wasn't it at all. Their bondage was sin. And of course, Yeshua pointed that out to them, the scribes and the Pharisees, you know. And whenever he was talking about the sons of Abraham, and they were talking about lineage when Yeshua was saying, if you were the sons of Abraham, you would do the works of Abraham, which Abraham was a righteous priest, just like Yeshua was here. If you'll just read and pay attention to what it says, Yosef was given a put over everything the king had. He took the land of Israel into it, and they became great. Now, talking about how the 12 tribes became great through this process and the lineage that followed Yosef and all of the 12 sons, and how it took place in Egypt when Moshe came on the scene to call them out of Christianity. Now, what Pastor starts doing here is he starts talking about how we ourselves have been put in this same bondage. Look at verse 40. He says, they start you off in the schools learning to serve the Lord, learning to serve the lords of Abelin. They've got many schools training many students to make money for them in their corporations. And he goes also, we'll go ahead and read it in verse 41. That's what Nimrod was. It was an ACU. It was a McMurray. It was a Horden Simmons. This is all talking about the colleges here, locally in Abelin, all Christian Catholic colleges. They taught service to Baal or to the world. They taught service to the world. That's what we have all been brought up in, except for the young, very young children here in the House of Yahweh that have been brought up in the House of Yahweh. You and I have all been brought up in a way of servitude to the world. They also created democracy. Democracy could be a great thing, and they teach you that it is a great thing, but what it truly amounts to is having control over a person. Now drop down where it says they can't step out of line in this system that they're in. They're in debt, borrowing money, and that's what takes place with these university and young college students, is the thing with the student loans. They put you in debt from the beginning to educate you to get out of debt, which there's no way that takes place. Not over a 4 or 5 year period of being educated in that Nimrod system. Okay? They're in debt, borrowing money, the student loans, you never get them paid off. They start you off in debt. Now look at verse 43, Pastor says, they don't teach salvation. Salvation comes when salvation comes with keeping the laws of Yahweh. It is service to Yahweh, not service to Baal. That is something that we need to highlight, is the only way to provide this great service, not only to ourselves, but to Yisrayl, to Yahweh, to Yeshua, is through the laws of Yahweh. This is how we even learn how to come to this understanding of what it is to truly love each other, and actually even to show love to our enemies, because we want to educate them in the same thing that we're being educated in. Okay? They don't teach salvation. Salvation comes with keeping the laws of Yahweh. Okay, now drop down to verse 44. Pastor says, well, the sons of Eob, he thought they were sinning, so he offered sacrifices for them. All of this time was spent on telling you about Eob and his sons and their sins, showing that even though a man is righteous, his sons could be exactly opposite. Okay? And his sons, going on, that is the world. That was the mixed up thing that we see in Genesis 49. A perfect case there, where with Jacob was a very righteous priest and all of his sons fell into God worship and actually brought God worship about, okay, in Egypt. Okay, what you see in Genesis 49, the evil, the fighting, the wars, the cruelty, all of these things are shown in Genesis 49, and which we know that through the genetics has trickled down to these last days. Let's drop down to 47. Verse 47, Pastor says, Then here in Eob, he goes into the original sons of Yahweh. And of course, that's how he laid it out. You know, the book of Eob, it talks about Eob and the trials he had, you know, starting with his sons. And then as the book of Eob progresses, it talks about the original sons of Yahweh. And that's what Pastor is showing us here. Eob knows they're sinning and he offers sacrifices. Then it goes to Yahweh's original sons. You see that? See that? In verse 6, now there was a day when the sons of Yahweh came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan, the adversary and accuser, also came among them. Satan came with her sons to present themselves. And, you know, pastors went over this quite a bit, you know, as in the way that the courts of heaven, you know, Satan was given this time period to persecute Eob, you know, for his righteousness. But in all that Eob did, he never turned against Yahweh. You know, now Eob's only fault, like Pastor has told us, was that he thought that being righteous, or practicing righteousness, that he would never suffer the persecution that he suffered within his own body. And that was something he did come to grips with. But in everything that he did, he never did go against Yahweh, the laws of Yahweh, or the prophecies. If you look at verse 49, look at verse 49, about a little bit further down in the middle of the paragraph. Pastor says, Go to 1 Yochanan 2. Eob's sons had sinned. Eob practiced righteousness. His sons, he knew or thought, were practicing sin. And, you know, if you look at it, you know, we all, before we came to the house of Yahweh, we practiced sin. You know, we were the same as Eob's sons there, you know. And continuing on there, in verse 50, Pastor says, 1 Yochanan 2:24, this all ties together with Yahweh, his original sons, Eob and his sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, and their descendants down to Yeshua. Therefore, let that abide in which you heard from the beginning. So this history from the beginning, from Genesis 1, you know, is like what Pastor is showing here. These things are recorded for our education in righteousness, to become a righteous teacher in the house of Yahweh, to be educated in that way. He talks further about Yeshua. If you look down in verse 51, Pastor says, he's reading in 1 Yochanan 2, if you have abiding in you, which you heard from the beginning, you also will abide in the Son, Yeshua, the Lamb, the seal opener, and referring to Revelation, and actually the way in which we received the knowledge. This seal is not open to anyone but Pastor. The seal's in the book of Revelation, you know, as it's meant for the house of Yahweh. The world can't understand it. Everyone in the world doesn't understand the book of Revelation at all. Now let's go down. Let's go over to verse 55 and the second column. For if Yahweh did not spare the Malachim who sinned, but will cast them into the abyss, delivering them into chains of darkness. And Pastor goes on to say, this is not an actual chains, not with a whip and a gun and a chair. This is ignorance. They were allowed to remain in their ignorance. The more you find out and the more you sin, the more you'll practice sin, and the more hell you're going to create in doing so. So with sin, there is an education in that also. We want to teach the results of sin. We don't want to experience it. What you and I, in the older generation, not the very, very young generation that is being brought up now, we were totally brought up in sin. And that's why it's so important to protect your children, to keep them from the pulls of the world. The pulls of the world will pull them just into what we were educated in, and that's our job and our responsibility. Okay, drop down to verse 57. And of course, this is in 2 Kepha 2. In verse 5, Pastor reads, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah. Now, this is where he starts going in the second part of the sermon about the house of Yahweh today and the preservation, of those righteous genes that were in Noah, and that was of course passed down to Yeshua and down to Yisrayl. And actually, we have part of that genetic makeup. If we wouldn't have part of that genetic makeup, we would have never been called. We would have never came to the house of Yahweh. Okay? So Yahweh shows that he protected, through Noah, he protected those righteous genes. He didn't spare his sons. Then he goes from that to Noah to show you he didn't spare the ancient world. And that's what it's talking about, when the scriptures refer to the ancient world. It's talking about the original sons of Yahweh. Okay, but saved Noah. Why? He was the preacher of righteousness. He saved Noah, the preacher of righteousness. And of course, that preacher of righteousness today is our great pastor and overseer, the great Gregorian Yisrayl Abel Hawkins, and what we strive to be as he is. In verse 58, now the reason Yahweh did this was that Noah actually brought forth these genes, and then he brought forth the teaching. You've got to have both. And of course, that's where he starts going into this era of the house of Yahweh. And actually what he covered in that previous sermon. If you get the time, these two sermons read together is a great education in what we're supposed to be doing. Okay, so that would be the 15th of the 10th Roman month and the 16th of the 10th Roman month during that great Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, so if you'll turn the page to 382 in verse 60, well, let's look up there because he starts talking about the microorganisms. Look at the paragraph above that. Pastor says, which of what he wanted, you will not suffer any of these great diseases of Egypt. These great diseases of Egypt are with us today, and they're multiplying like crazy throughout the nations. They're losing the race with antibiotics, and that's one thing that's a testimony to us that we should really be able to understand that the microorganisms, the actual medicines or the pharmaceuticals today cannot even subdue these perverted and unrighteous microorganisms and genes that have been perverted. Okay, these great diseases of Egypt are with us today, and they're multiplying like crazy. They're losing the race with antibiotics. The microorganisms are actually outsmarting them. Okay, and he's referring to these antibiotics. In verse 60, he says, notice the righteousness now, but save Noah one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the unrighteous, those who were lawbreakers. Well, Noah was warning the people, and this is all about what we're doing today. You know, this same situation has taken place today, but you and I know it's not going to be a flood. You know, it's going to be nuclear war. You know, not only is the warning going out, but the actual nuclear wars are going to take place, just as a flood took place in Noah's day. The writing here makes it seem like Yahweh brought the flood. He actually had nothing to do with bringing it. He was trying to prevent it, and Noah was preaching for 120 years. While he was preparing the ark, he was preaching, but none of the people heard what he said. They didn't believe it. Yahweh said we'd have the same scoffers in the last days. And you know as well as I do, you know, that there have been many people that have come to the house of Yahweh and actually have turned away, you know, have actually fallen away in this same type of situation. The same thing took place with Noah. There was, a pastor had said, I remember one sermon years ago, that Noah had a great following. He had a great following, and look at what it came down to, just his family, you know, his immediate family. Okay? And verse 61, now look at verse 6, and condemn the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Sodomites, and this is what we fight against today. Now go over to verse 63, verse 6, and condemn the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes. This was being preached too. Yahweh was telling them that the earth was going to vomit them out. They were bringing too much evil on that particular spot, and it wouldn't be allowed in Yahweh's plan. Now that spot today is everything but what is here in this area of Texas. You know, I mean, this area is going to be protected because we have to have the area for the multitudes that are coming. But we can see in that example of what Pastor brought forth in speaking of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, now if Yahweh had not done this, there would be no salvation because it was a must that Yahweh brought forth Yeshua. Yeshua is the one who paid for our past sins. He pays for anyone's past sins who will repent and convert. Okay, and then Pastor goes on, and the last verse here, in verse 67, the only protection Yahweh offers is the house of Yahweh. You'd have to repent and come to the house of Yahweh for it. But you won't do that, Vatican. You'd rather be Vaticanizing until you die, or as the song goes, that I hope everyone has learned, until your last dying breath. You know, it's a great blessing to be in the house of Yahweh. We need to really start preparing our minds and our hearts as we really get close to Yeshua's memorial. You know, we don't want to really be taking anything, you know, in that night that we can't square away with our brother. And, of course, any sin at all. So we're going to go ahead and close there.